in part because this is a sheathed bacterium. So the sheathed bacterium also in Bergey's first edition used to have their own category because the fact that they form these sheaths that makes them seem like they are possibly branched or such because several organisms are held together at one time. Those also can help them attach. But our example in here is going to be this organism, Burkholderia. This organism is responsible, and especially this particular one, I should put on here, Burkholderia cepacia. This one is associated with cystic fibrosis. People that have cystic fibrosis produce a lot of extra mucus in their lungs, and they have a tendency to struggle and struggle and struggle with fighting infection. So this organism was really first recognized as being a problem with cystic fibrosis patients. It also, you can see here, has become a major nosocomial pathogen. It's also a plant pathogen. It's something that's really like found in soil and water and other things. But it also has been responsible for a number of outbreaks in the public as being associated with mouthwash, with Tylenol, with eye drops. So somehow it's been a contaminant in the raw materials. And we had unfortunately, I had a phone call from a student about a couple weeks after class got out, asking me, and this was at a time, this was maybe like 3 or 4 years ago, asking me what I knew about this organism. It was before that we were talking about it in class. And the reason why she was asking me was because her 4-year-old son just passed away with it. He was like the normal, healthy kid, got some kind of respiratory infection like around Thanksgiving, seemed to recover from it, but then got sick again like right around the holidays. And then he just seemed like he wasn't himself, and her husband took him to the doctor. She worked at Henry Mayo, and her husband took him to the doctor. They ended up airlifting him to Loma Linda, and that day he passed away with this from Tylenol. It was right around the time, I don't know if you remember, about 4 years ago, that there was a recall of, I think it was like 21 different products of infant and children's Tylenol because it was contaminated with this particular organism. I never found out like exactly what their outcome was, but that's what he had, and he had been using one of those particular Tylenol, so at that moment in time, that's what they were attributing it to. Really tragic. Like, you know, you hear about these things and you read about them, but it's like so different when it happens to somebody that you know or somebody close to you or something, because it's easy, you know, when we go through and we say, oh, there's this many thousand cases per year, but you feel like, yeah, but I've never actually heard of anybody that got, say, salmonella poisoning or food poisoning or something like that. So this organism is something that really, when you see here, becoming, you know, that it's changing, that they originally thought that it was really not something that the average healthy person or child would have to be concerned about. So let me see if I have any. It was 2009, 21 batches of children infant Tylenol. Nasal sprays also, there was an outbreak with nasal sprays. It is one that forms biofilms as well. So I don't have any actual numbers. I didn't look up to see how many cases they have per year. But something that you want to be aware of, just because of the fact that it's something that's not uncommon in the environment, and because of that, contaminating raw materials is kind of an issue. So I want you to know that organism, and it's an example of a sheath bacteria. This next one, Bordetella. Do you guys know which one this is right off for that, because this should sound familiar. Bordetella pertussis. This is the one that I want you to know about. I think people are hearing more and more about this. Like just a number of years ago, this would have been something like, oh, pertussis, yes, people get vaccinated for that. Oh, on to the next. But that's not what it's like now. Now we're like pretty much like having an epidemic of this particular organism because of the issues with vaccination. So more and more people stop vaccinating. People feeling like, well, why should I vaccinate for this? It's not really a big problem. And what had happened, we ended up then with more and more people getting it. And now we have more and more people who have it. And now people who were vaccinated, like older people like me, you know, people that had been vaccinated throughout, like in their earlier life, normally there wasn't a lot of pertussis around, so older people didn't pick it up either because they'd been vaccinated enough, even though they maybe didn't have a huge immunity to it, but they weren't getting boosters anymore because really there weren't a lot of people out there that had it. So now a lot of older people are getting it because now we have all these younger people who are getting it. It's just contributing to the number of people that are carrying it. So it's kind of an issue, I think. Here's 1980, and here we are now. Okay, so this is definitely a problem. And I think when people don't hear about how tragic some of these infections are, I think especially that group that felt comfortable with not vaccinating because they never knew anybody that had it, they didn't talk to people that had it. It's not like the older generations who remember like growing up and hearing children or adults that had whooping cough. Because of the type of cough they have, it's a very characteristic type of like, almost like the croupy kind of cough, and they can't get enough oxygen. And then babies and children end up dying then from whooping cough just literally for that reason. So it's like you were around a time where you knew about people that had children that died or infants that died, or you ever heard people having it, it kind of means a lot more when you have access to the vaccination. Once the rates decline so much that people who chose not to vaccinate had this feeling like, oh, well, whooping cough, like nobody has it, and now we just really have a big turnaround. So the numbers have really just consistently gone up and up and up. Really, like there are 28,000 cases in 2010, 7,000 of them were in California. So California kind of having that bigger population that's thinking that it's healthier maybe not to vaccinate. I think the vaccination issue is a really interesting issue, and then CDC just came out with another statement that they have studied again the connection between vaccinations and autism, and there is no connection. In fact, the doctor who originally put forth that research lost his license, had to issue, you know, an apology and a retraction because the work that he did was like based on a few cases only, and he lied, and he admitted that he lied. But it's one of those things that have stayed in the population for some reason, like people just truly believe, no matter what, that there's this correlation between autism and vaccination. Even though in other countries throughout the world, in Sweden, their study showed that there was actually a higher autism rate in the unvaccinated population than the vaccinated population. And again, this doctor who did the original research retracted all that and lost his license. So if people are considering not getting vaccinations or not having your kids vaccinated, it's like definitely something you should look into, because there are certain reasons why they wouldn't vaccinate some people, especially like if there's some kind of sensitivity to eggs sometimes, or if there's other things going on, if they would be concerned about a fever or something like that. But other than that, like some of the choices people are making have long-term effects. And pertussis is really a good example of that. If this happens with other things, then we're going to be in trouble too. Diphtheria, which has been under control too, is really a nasty organism to get to. With that one, it develops like it's going to be listed later, but you develop like this thick mucousy membrane that literally just chokes somebody to death. So it's like another thing that we don't want coming back into the population just simply because people feel like they don't need to vaccinate and their main concern is they don't want their kids to get autism. If it's, you know, people should just be informed, in other words, before making those kinds of decisions. Yes?
What are the rates of, I don't know if you know, but the rates of pertussis in other countries? Is it?
You know, I have to look it up. I don't remember offhand. In other countries, though, especially in developing countries, infectious disease is the #1 cause of death. In here, we have heart disease and cancer, and strokes and such. So I think that, again, there's this feeling that, you know, your immune system would be stronger if we were exposed to all of this stuff. You guys have heard, like, those theories, right? That we have all these problems with asthma and other things because, like, we're too clean, because we're not exposed to everything. And I just, like, have to challenge that with then why in the countries where they're exposed to everything are they dying from infectious disease? Because why isn't their immune system so strong that they're fighting off all that stuff? That doesn't even make sense at all. Yes, I agree that maybe somebody's immune system might be oversensitive, that gives them asthma and allergies and some other things, but it doesn't make you have a stronger immune system because you're exposed to more things, because if it did, then infants and adults in those developing countries wouldn't all be dying from those infections. Right, you guys know what I'm talking about? There was one other thing I was going to say about this. Oh, the thing about everybody getting vaccinated too, or at least most people, is if everybody is mostly vaccinated, then you don't have that organism running around everywhere. So the people who can't be vaccinated are going to be protected. Okay, because they won't be exposed to all of these things because there won't be these people having it. So, you know, it's important from that standpoint too, because there are going to be some people that won't be able to be vaccinated. And we would want them to be protected. But if it's just a choice based on a totally flawed research, then that has to get out there more. And definitely they're really putting forth something about pertussis right now, because I've seen like a couple of commercials about it as well.
With the baby, it coughs and sound all weird. Has anyone seen the commercial?
Yeah.
Yeah, right?
And that's like one of those like public service announcements. But see, it's kind of a long time coming because this has been going on for about 15 years. Like where it really started becoming evident that pertussis was on the rise, was on the rise, it was on the rise, it was on the rise, and now they required all the kids, I know, in our school districts out here to get pertussis vaccinations. But just because they require it doesn't mean that you can't, as a parent, then like have a letter saying that you don't have to take it. They're not going to force them if there's some reason. So it's just something that you guys should be informed about. After you've had microbiology, you should really be able to read the literature and decide for yourself whether or not there's anything in there that you would consider a concern. So definitely need to know about that. Okay. How about, I want to mention something. I want you to know about this organism, Thiobacillus. Thiobacillus is really something that's becoming more of interest it's something that can degrade metals. So you see here, production of sulfuric acid can cause corrosion of concrete and metal structures. Again, it is something that shows the diversity of the organisms, but also when you see here may increase soil fertility by releasing sulfate, and it's used in leaching metals, you know, in that industry. And they're also realizing that this is something that can be helpful economically. So this is something that the economics has really pushed forward a lot of research with this organism. Being able to treat water and wastewater that comes from the mining industry and then using these organisms to get some of the metals out. Also, if they use this organism as a biological pesticide, then this thing of releasing sulfate and then producing some sulfuric acid, which then causes the pH to be lowered, which prevents the growth of certain pests. So that's another thing. So right now, this is an organism in which they're really thinking that it can be extremely useful and something that can be very helpful to the environment too. All these, like, I don't think anybody did a paper on bioremediation this time, right? Because I think people became interested a little bit when there were the oil spills, because then they could use the organisms to break down the oils. But there are really a lot of organisms already being used in ways to reduce the contaminants in the environment. Because you have organisms that can live in all these different environments and do all of these types of physiological processes, then these organisms then could be used to get rid of some of the pollutants. So that's something that, yeah, so it's just something that this would be a good one for you guys to know about too. You'll probably hear more about it. We still have a lot more to go in this particular. This is the chapter that I think has the most example. In case you're getting scared here, you just keep going from example to example. Here's two more that we want to talk about. This first one, Legionella pneumophila, the cause of Legionnaire's disease. I don't know if you remember a couple of years ago getting a letter from the college saying that they had closed down see, I just keep thinking of it at the C building, but I think, is that one the one that's Hasley? Is that what it's called? It's, who said yes? Or did somebody say yes? Where's Hasley? Like if you just keep going around, it turns into Hasley, right? Right, oh, you guys do. Okay. So did you guys ever get a letter like that, saying that they had closed it?
Yeah.
Nobody's been here for that long? It was only a couple years ago. Really? Nobody in here?
What year?
Just like 2 years ago.
I was here.
It was 3 years ago.
I was here 3 years ago.
Well, anyway, Legionnaire's disease, this is something that is really a serious infection if people are to inhale this bacteria. So there's a lot of things that you want to make sure that you write down about this particular organism. It first was discovered because in 1976, when they had the bicentennial, the Legionnaires were meeting in Philadelphia, and a lot of people got very sick when they were staying in a particular hotel. And then it turned out that not just people that were staying in the hotel got sick, but even people who had just come into the hotel. And not just people who had come into the hotel, but even people that had just walked by the front of the hotel. And it was really difficult for them to figure out what this was. At the time that this happened, there was no evidence that it was a bacteria. They didn't know if it was a virus. They didn't know if it, was something else. But people got a severe type of pneumonia. A lot of people died. The Legionnaires, a lot of them were elderly, but not everybody that got it was elderly. It turned out to be this organism, Legionella pneumophila. That's how it was named at that time. And they found this organism everywhere. So despite how difficult it was to originally grow, once they figured out what was needed in the media to grow it, which was a particular amino acid, they realized that the organism is ubiquitous, meaning that it's found everywhere. So even somebody who their job is to work on heating and air conditioning will know something about this particular infection. That's why in heating and air conditioning, you cannot have any standing water anywhere, because this organism is commonly found in water, and if it becomes an aerosol, you can inhale it, and that's where people can get very, very sick. So it changed a lot with the engineering and the design of heating and air conditioning systems, because nobody realized that this organism was something that was really so common. So this particular organism was found in that building, the Hasley Hall, because somebody ended up with Legionnaire's disease. And this is something that has to be investigated by the health department. So they came in, they closed the building, they tested everything, they found the organism. They also found another staff member who had antigens or antibodies for Legionnaire's disease, but it was a different strain. So they don't really think that the person got it from that particular building, but the instructor was teaching in that building, then somebody else that worked in that building had it. So it's something that has to be in an aerosol form. Some of the other cases that have occurred from showers, from spas. There was somebody who almost died with it from a hotel in Santa Barbara, where, you know how like you have like the nice hotel room that has like the whirlpool bathtub? Okay, so if it was like a spa outside, it would have to have chlorine in it. That would like kill off the organism. But when it's in the own room, then it's not treated. But when the tub would get drained, there was always that little layer of water that was just in the bottom of the tub that just didn't go down the drain. So then when the spa gets turned on, the person, and it turned out like that it was a person, I think, from the San Fernando Valley that was a nurse actually, that ended up, she was staying in that hotel, inhaled the organism, which when they did the study, they found that that's where it came from. It was just in the water system, and it was just like staying at the bottom of the tub, not getting all the way drained out. And then when the whirlpool spa would be turned on, it would make enough of an aerosol. So it's really a concern, not because so many people get it, but because it has a high fatality rate. So once somebody does get it, and if they actually have Legionnaire's disease, it is a high fatality rate. It's hard to treat. So you see here, it can also invade protozoa, and that can help it stay alive in the water system. But invade cooling towers, air conditioning, hot tubs. All of these things then would create aerosols, and then you could just breathe it in like that. About somewhere around 4,000 cases per year in the U.S. So it's not like huge numbers, but it's enough because of that high fatality rate to be a concern. It also can produce a lesser disease called Pontiac fever. It's the same organism, just a different strain. When somebody has Pontiac fever, they are going to have those antibodies to Legionella pneumophila, but it's more like somebody has a bad flu. It's been associated sometimes with things that called like the sick building syndrome. Have you ever heard of that? The sick building syndrome kind of became kind of a catch-all from the high-rise buildings in which they keep recycling air. You know, usually it's kind of to save money because, like, especially if you're air conditioning in, you know, Southern California where it's hot, they then don't bring in sometimes as much outside air because the air is hot. It's easier to just keep cooling down the same air. So then you start seeing like people throughout the building, you know, complaining of things and maybe not having anything that's really obvious. That's why they kind of named it like that sick building syndrome, because nobody really knew. Are they just catching like each other's viruses because they're not bringing in enough outside air, or is there something more to it? So Legionnaire's disease, Pontiac fever, both associated with the Legionella pneumophila, and a concern because of the aerosol that is created in those particular situations. There's a nice picture of what it looks like. See all the flagella. Coxiella. This is another one that's really very similar to the Brucella abortus. And since you guys had to know Brucella abortus, it's like, do I want you to know? Maybe I'll let you pass on Coxiella, but I'll just mention something about it. Coxiella burnetii, which is an organism that causes Q fever. Q fever is also with this people that work with animals, and also associated with raw milk. There's only a few hundred cases per year in the U.S. because a lot of the animals do get vaccinated, and because, you know, it's not as common for people to drink raw milk. So it's very similar in a lot of ways, you know, with the type of symptoms that people have and such. So since you're knowing Brucella abortus, then I'll let you pass on memorizing Coxiella burnetii, the cause of Q fever. It's kind of unfortunate, but there wasn't a slide on Pseudomonas. Okay, but you do still have to know Pseudomonas. Pseudomonas aeruginosa. It's aeruginosa, aeruginosa. So Pseudomonas, you know, because we have Pseudomonas fluorescens. This is an organism that causes, or that forms a large capsule. And Pseudomonas is also the organism that they have found living for 14 years in disinfectant. It's been the cause of numerous nosocomial infections, very common nosocomial infections. Otherwise, Pseudomonas aeruginosa is a common cause of like what's known as swimmer's ear. So if anybody ever was a competitive swimmer or, you know, spent a lot of time swimming, some people are really prone to getting that swimmer's ear. You guys have probably heard of that before, right? It's a common cause of urinary tract infections, other kinds of infections, skin infections, folliculitis. It's called folliculitis, an inflammation of the hair follicles. That's something that's associated with like using spas and hot tubs. Something that outbreaks would occur from, you know, hotel spas and such. Folliculitis is just, you know, it looks like just a really ugly rash, because if you can imagine that hair follicles being inflamed, how many hair follicles you have, you know, in different areas of your body.
How do you spell it?
Folliculitis.
Oh, no.
Eric.
Oh, A-E-R. Eric. A-E-R-O-G-I-N-O-S.
G what? Sorry.
Oh, let's see. I-N-O-S-A. It kind of became, and the reason why it's associated with this slide that kind of comes up here, the sepsis and septic shock, because it's one of those organisms that many, many organisms can cause sepsis or septic shock. Sepsis is when you have the infection in the bloodstream. But a couple of years ago, again, was a case that kind of got worldwide notoriety, even though this kind of thing happens, like, unfortunately, far too frequently. But it was a young girl. She was a supermodel from Brazil. Does anybody remember hearing anything about this? It was a couple of years ago. She was like 21 years old, and I guess she was just famous as a supermodel. And she ended up dying from septic shock from Pseudomonas aeruginosa. And so, for some reason, that particular case, I think because she was young and known worldwide, just got a lot of media attention. It kind of scared a lot of people, like, oh, it could like kill somebody in such a short time. It ended up that she had had a urinary tract infection that she was sort of fighting for about a month. And the organism was an antibiotic resistant organism, and then it ended up like becoming septic, and she was in the hospital, and they ended up amputating, like her hands and feet and legs and everything, trying to prevent her from dying with sepsis or septic shock, and then she ended up like dying with just like in a couple of days. So it kind of made it even seem more dramatic because there wasn't like that much about the history of, the battling for a month, but she wasn't really sick for that month. So in other words, when you have an antibiotic resistant organism and it gets into the circulatory system, that's going to be something that is extremely dangerous. And there's just the process of shock, that idea of doing amputations like that sometimes can help save somebody because of just like the process that the body goes through when it's going into septic shock like that. Other gram-negative organisms are associated with septic shock as well, in part because they produce endotoxins. Those toxins are released when the organism dies off, and then all of a sudden you can get a lot of those toxins at one time. But Pseudomonas is just, especially Pseudomonas aeruginosa, an important pathogen because it's an important nosocomial infection, because it is a hardy organism that is protected inside that capsule. I mean, how could you have an organism that's not even a spore-forming organism that can survive disinfectant or antiseptic? There's the case, of course, with the 14 years, but you would be surprised if you looked into this, just how many nosocomial infections have come from antiseptics or disinfectants. It's not the only organism that's ever been found to be able to live in a disinfectant. And I think I told you guys how when I was working in the clean room, we would regularly have growth from the alcohol. So in fact, like there was never a time that we didn't get growth from the alcohol, because after we would test all the products, then we would take the alcohol and filter it and grow that filter, and it always grew in both anaerobic and aerobic conditions. So a lot of organisms can survive on that. So Pseudomonas aeruginosa. Now we have Vibrio cholera. I do know somebody did you do the paper on Vibrio cholera? I think I mentioned something about cholera once before, but this is the organism that really, if somebody picks up cholera, and fortunately here in the U.S., Vibrio cholera is not the most common of the Vibrios. There are other Vibrios that are much more common, but also very severe in other ways, just maybe not as dramatic sounding as Vibrio cholera. Vibrio vulnificus is one of them that people can pick up from eating raw oysters. Nobody in here eats raw oysters, right?
Wait.
Raw milk and raw oysters are the only two foods in which the government requires a warning label. Oh, wait. Alcohol, I guess if you throw that in with the food, okay? Alcohol and cigarettes. All four of those things all have a warning label. Those are the only four things. Okay, you know about alcohol and cigarettes. Now we mentioned something about raw milk, and I think maybe when I talked about it last time, I didn't mention that if you get a carton of raw milk, it actually has a warning label on there telling you that you could end up with a possibly fatal infection from drinking it. As well as, I'm sure you've seen in the nice restaurants, they have that warning sign up that says raw oysters, and you know, you're taking a risk that you could end up with a fatal infection. You guys didn't know that? You guys didn't eat raw oysters. And raw scallops.
Those are so good.
Anybody eat raw scallops from the sushi bar?
Yes.
After, like, I went to a public health lecture, and basically the statistics were that if you eat raw scallops or raw oysters regularly, you will get sick eventually. It's only a matter of time. But, you know, I quit eating. I think, like, anybody could live without raw oysters. You just swallow them, you know, like, why is that, like, so good? Like, you don't even chew them up, because if you chew them up, they're all like gravelly, and sand in them. So like, I could live without that. Raw scallops, I thought that was gonna be terrible, because I really like raw scallops. But after that day, I never ate them again, ever. And now, like, now I'm okay with it. You just get used to it. You're like, I don't even remember how good they used to taste.
They really are good.
Pardon? They're really
They're
good.
really good.
Maybe you should read about the symptoms of these things a little bit more. It's not very likely that you would pick up cholera from eating raw oysters or raw scallops here, but you might pick up the Vibrio mellificus, and you could end up very, very, very sick. When you just think about like any kind of stomach flu that you've had that was miserable, imagine that like 50 times worse. And then is it really that worth? I don't think so. But Vibrio cholera is something that when somebody gets the infection, and again, I think I mentioned this once before, that you could die within 24 hours. It causes such severe dehydration. It's just literally you lose all your water. So if you can be treated, it's very treatable. But if you could imagine being in a situation where you're just like having severe, severe, severe diarrhea, just trying to get yourself someplace. If you don't have somebody that could take you someplace, like people end up not being able to get help that are in those situations. So it's something that all over the world there are epidemics of cholera right now. Like thousands of people get it. And there are problems whenever we've had some kind of natural disaster. Haiti is really suffering with, I don't know, do you have any numbers? I didn't write down any numbers, I don't think. Here in the US, we had under 1,000 cases of cholera. But, and treatment, you know, is usually close by. Do you remember what some of the numbers were from Haiti? It's millions of people, I know that. So certain strains, like there have been epidemics that have been going on for something like 100 years or something like that, where it's been, you know, all through Africa, all through Asia, all through South America. And then the concern is if somebody comes here and is carrying it, then we'll pick it up here as well. And I know it's been a long time now since this happened, but I remember one year that with soccer, there was a team coming from one of the countries in which there was an outbreak, and the U.S. was like really like they didn't want that team to come into the U.S. at all because they were just afraid to bring carriers, you know, to the U.S. to maybe start something. But otherwise, like here, not very common to get it. It's the other Vibrios that are not as dramatic, but still severe illnesses too. And it's likely to pick it up from undercooked shellfish. Because some of these organisms, some of the Vibrios are carried by the shellfish or by the mammals that live close to the coast. And then you have a lot of raw sewage that goes out into the water. So when they harvest things like oysters, they're close in to the shore. So there's that exposure always to those fecal organisms. So especially like in places like, what is that, the Gulfs, like around Florida and Louisiana and such, that's where like they have more problems. Vibrio cholera. And you know, probably, I don't remember if we've talked about this before, but raw sewage always goes out into the ocean. Like, it's very, very unusual if none goes out, because you can't have like sewage systems that can handle so much. So like the overflow goes in, and so if there's any kind of rain, that floods also the sewage system. So that means like here, when we have rain, sewage always goes out to the ocean. So you know, whenever there's a storm, there's always those things at the beach, like don't swim around this area, right? And you know why it's like that, right? Because like raw sewage is going out there. And then people like just still go out there and swim. Who says that? You guys all know how to check like the ratings now that we're going into summer, right? You know how to check the beach ratings, right? That you can go into the county of Los Angeles. Because you'd be surprised, like places like Santa Monica Bay and stuff like that, they always have like a C, D, or F. And during the summer, when you have all those people going out there, you'd be surprised because public health standards really allow, basically in a summer weekend in Southern California, probably anywhere from like 10,000 to 100,000 people are going to get some kind of illness from going to the ocean. But it's usually something like some kind of intestinal virus. It's going to last a couple days. It's not worth trying to prevent people from going in. It's just that when you take that many people that go to the ocean on a day when it's like a summer day, that just a small risk just becomes magnified. But again, it's not like something that's going to kill people, but those are like all within the range. Because if you try to do more than that, it would just cost too much money, you know, to try to keep the water even cleaner and to keep the sewage systems like where there isn't any sewage going in.
How do you check it online?
You know what area that's also really bad is always like around Cali, at Avalon. There's always an F. I've never checked when it's not an F.
How do you do it?
You just go to the County of Los Angeles. County of Los Angeles. So if you just like Google County of Los Angeles beach rating or something, it'll come up. Somewhere around Malibu, there's always a problem. Santa Monica is always a problem. Dockweiler Beach is always bad. And everybody knows about Dockweiler because that's the only place you can have a bonfire.
Oh well.
But just go for the bonfire.
There's one with water there too.
There's a nice picture of the Vibrio. Was there anything that you can add, Erica?
We can double
Nothing, you
it.
covered everything? Or you don't remember? Did you write your test, your paper? Okay, there's a lot in this particular category too, so let me see. I guess we can talk about E. coli, and then maybe we'll get two things in here. You know about Escherichia. I think the important one for you to really know about are these particular E. coli's, these pathogenic E. coli's. And you see here these ETEC, EIEC, EPEC. These are the different toxins associated with the different pathogenic strains. Sometimes they're referred to as like the STECs. And like right now, you don't really know what this S stands for. This is a Shiga toxin. Shiga toxin, like SHIGA, Shiga toxin, it might be on here someplace. Shiga toxin.
Sugar.
Okay. These are like the types of toxins that are associated with the organism Shigella, which is another organism you guys are gonna have to know. Okay, but there are these very, very pathogenic strains of E. coli that produce certain toxins, and you can see there's a whole bunch of them. Enterohemorrhagic, enteroinvasive, enterotoxigenic. It just depends on what the toxins are, but they really tend to kind of lump them together in the Shiga-like toxin E. coli, so Shiga toxin E. coli. Okay, so if you look up RAIDs or something, that's normally how you have to look them up. This is the organism in which you see the example here, E. coli 0157H7, that I've like referred to a number of times. This is associated with all kinds of things now. First it was, the raw hamburger, undercooked hamburger. That's where, like, first there was the Sizzler thing, and then there was a Jack in the Box thing, and I can't remember which other ones that kind of got a bad name for this. This organism, of course, being E. coli, is going to be a fecal organism. Now the outbreaks have been in just about everything. Spinach, lettuce, sprouts, cilantro, green onions, all kinds of things. Because around areas where you have agriculture, you also have animals, and animals carry it. Oh, back when it first came out too, and there was like the Jack in the Box and the Sizzler thing, there was also the Adwala apple juice. Do you remember that one? Because that was a child who died from that. And that turned out that apple juice is not pasteurized. Okay, pasteurized, it reaches a certain temperature that should kill off pathogens, but people don't want things to be pasteurized because they feel like that's going to reduce the nutritional content. But in this particular company, if they take the apples directly from the tree, then it's not going to be pasteurized. But when they really investigated it, basically what was happening is they were taking apples not just from the tree, but also from the ground. Okay, if apples are on the ground, then what could they be exposed to? And it turned out that way in that pristine area of Oregon and Washington, that the deers carried the STEC, the E. coli 0157H7. So you don't think about things like that. You think about that humans would have this, or maybe animals that were close to humans. You don't think about animals that live in the back country or anything like that. So you have the cows and all of that when it rains, all that water gets washed in. That water is like irrigation. It gets mixed in with all that. So now we have like vegetables that are in the ground that are exposed to that. You have to be very careful with vegetables. That's something that I think people didn't used to think about so much. In fact, just going to the grocery store and you ask a question like, oh, how is this or how is that? Are these like the better, fruits or vegetables or something? And then the produce people are like, well, here, taste it. Like they'll just taste things without washing them. But you guys don't do that. But people used to do that kind of thing. If you're going to eat raw fruits and vegetables, you've got to be very careful on washing them really well. I guess it takes away a little. But if they do things like the high temperature short time, then they usually are bringing it up to a high temperature for only 3 seconds. So how much does it really lose? I'm not really sure like what the studies show as far as how much it is. Most of the people in the industries claim that it doesn't. So, I know raw milk people say that it tastes a lot different. And, but it's really like not that high of a temperature for only 3 seconds because they just they use like tubing and they just shoot it in and just heat it all at once and then shoot it out. In the older ways where they do batch method, then it might be for 30 minutes at a medium high temperature. So that would be probably more likely to, lose some nutrition. So with this E. coli, the problem with this, when you look at these things, facing lesions, hemorrhagic colitis, where's the one with the, okay, there's more here too. Oh, I don't see where it is. Well, anyway, I know it's in here someplace. You can end up, oh, here it is, with this hemolytic uremic syndrome, which they refer to as HUS, hemolytic uremic syndrome. So this is a problem. You get this, it's not like just getting an ordinary foodborne illness where you're gonna have vomiting and diarrhea for a few weeks and you might get really sick. This ends up with permanent kidney failure. This ends up with dialysis for the rest of your life. So the whole thing of eating undercooked meat, well, hamburger, because there's a big difference between steak and roast and hamburger. If you just think about what happens in the grinding process, everything that's touched anything has now been ground and mixed in all of the hamburger. In fact, I wish that I had the exact numbers, but there's a woman, I guess she was something like an Olympic athlete who ended up getting an E. coli 0157H7 infection, and she ended up like losing her legs and really, really sick, all kinds of problems, and she's been in the process of suing. And it was a particular attorney who was representing her, who was like, most of the cases in fact, I think all the cases he does these days are all to do with foodborne illnesses, so he's kind of become like an expert on that. It ended up that, like, it's one thing when you just think about grinding up all of that at a meat packing place, right? But it turned out in her case that the hamburger that she had actually came from a batch of hamburger that came from 17 different meat packing facilities. So remember how last time I said about how things just aren't the way they used to be? I mean, towns had their own meat packing facilities. You had a limited number of animals there. Now you have meat packing facilities that are huge, that whenever there is some kind of outbreak, like if you've watched the news over like the past 5 to 10 years, you would be seeing that kind of thing, that they have like contamination and literally millions of pounds of meat would have to be destroyed, because that's how big this is. And now in this kind of case is sort of brought into the forefront that not only are they using meat from their own packing house, which is already huge, but then they're also selling it to other places. They're taking all these different batches, and now it's all being ground together like that. So all it takes is contamination in one place, and now for something to be ground, every single piece of it has touched a surface, right? And if something was just a little bit on the outside, it's now mixed in throughout. And now you've created a surface area for the bacteria to reproduce on in case there's a handling issue. If you have something like a steak, all you have is a surface on each side that gets cooked. So you don't have the same kind of problem as if you have something that has been ground, and it's been ground with hundreds and hundreds of pounds of other meat. So do you see, like, there's a huge difference. This is not the same kind of meat in which people got, where you could talk to somebody in your family that, when I was a kid, like, we used to eat little pieces of raw hamburger. That would be disastrous now. If you eat rare hamburger, you can only eat it if it comes from like one of those restaurants where they actually use a good quality piece of meat and grind it there. Like those kind of restaurants do exist. They're like high-end restaurants in which you could get a special, kind of hamburger because they grind their own meat because they're taking meat that's not been ground and mixed with hundreds and hundreds of other pounds of meat. So now the risk, you would be surprised, but when they do surveys at the grocery store, they will find almost 100% of meat and chicken is contaminated with salmonella and E. coli. Okay, so why don't so many people get sick? That's how this always comes up. Usually you cook it, right? And there has to be an infected dose. This organism, normally E. coli, you have to ingest a good amount of it to get sick. Some of these strains are lower dose. Some of these strains you don't have to get as much. But still, something like salmonella and E. coli 0157H7, usually you have to get, some thousands of organisms, tens of thousands, maybe even hundreds of thousands. So that's why you don't always get sick, but cross-contamination happens, and that is what increases it. So a lot of times what happens is you bring the meat home. Have you ever watched somebody make hamburger patties? That's such a bad idea. Because what do you think little droplets are doing? They're splattering onto the surface area that you're going to cut salad on or something like that, right? I always used to just taking things out of a package. Did you ever think how difficult it is to really take something out of a package without causing some little splatter of something to go someplace? You would be surprised, and I was always complaining about that, but this year somebody reported one of the I don't know, a researcher someplace, I don't remember even where it came from, but they reported that was one of the worst things. So I was see, I've been vindicated, it's not just me, because when you take things, when you rip open the plastic and it kind of pops or something like that, you get little droplets of things that end up sometimes where you don't realize. And a huge number of foodborne illnesses come from just cross-contamination of something getting on foods that you're not going to cook, or getting on a surface area, a plate or silverware or something like that. Not to mention how many people actually wipe their hands off on things without washing them when they touch something. You'd be surprised. I know you guys wouldn't be that surprised, right? Have you ever watched other people prepare foods?
Yeah.
Have you ever just watched those cooking shows? And they're just totally handling raw meat, and then they just
wipe it on the
wipe it.
towel.
Yeah.
And you always wipe it on the same towel.
And then they take that hand and then they touch all these other things that they're going to touch later. And they never tell you that please don't do this at home. We're just doing this for the sake of the fact that it's a cooking show. They really should do that.
But they eat the
Because if
product.
you did that, but they probably don't. They never eat that one. They eat one that was already cooked before. If people really did that, which some people really do, right? I remember going to somebody's house, when my kids were in preschool, and they were making chicken, and it was the dad was making the chicken. He was handling all the raw chicken, and he was opening the cupboard doors, and he just wiped his hands on the towel, the hand towel, and stuff without washing them first. And then he was just touching all these things, and I'm just sitting there oh my gosh, I'm totally not going to eat here. It's to me, it was just, how do people not end up sick like that? You guys wouldn't do that, would you? But the other thing is that grocery store, when you go into the meat area, do you not see all the draining blood that is in the fat that gets on the outside of the packages? Or when you pick up the package, it's ready to come out, and if you just put it in your refrigerator like that, it's gonna drain out onto things. I would never touch the outside of a meat package.
Is your house really clean?
No. My house is so messy and dusty and everything, but you will not find raw meat sitting. I open like all of the raw meat like on my oven door because I can't even stand to have it like in the sink because I just think it's gonna get like on the faucet thing or something like that. And I don't ever touch like a raw meat. I'm